I have to admit that when I saw Dr. Kang on CBS being interviewed a little bit more than a month ago, my reasons for wanting her to speak at the Vail Symposium may have been somewhat selfish. I have probably started way too many conversations with the question, hey, you want to hear something really gross? So this evening, I am looking forward to a gruesome conversation with absolutely no social backlash. Dr. Kang is also an author. She writes young adult, adult fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. She's a graduate of Columbia, as well as the New York University School of Medicine. She completed her residency and her chief residency at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. She is a practicing physician, and she's gained a reputation for helping fellow writers achieve medical accuracy in their fiction. Her poetry and nonfiction have been published in numerous journals, including the Journal of the American Medical Association and the Annals of Internal Medicine. So when I saw the moderator for tonight's program, I thought it was a match made in Claire heaven. First of all, you have a doctor who writes about medicine's dark history, paired with a historian who studies humanity's fight against disease. So tonight's moderator is Professor Maura Chun. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado in 2015, where she researched the 2018 flu pandemic in British India, focusing on the inadequate response of the British government. She's been teaching the history of World War II and the Holocaust at Metropolitan State University in Minnesota since 2016. Her research interests lie in the intersection of the history of public health and empire, while her teaching focuses on the history of war and genocide. So I'd like to thank both of them for joining us this evening. I'm going to hand off to Dr. Kang. She'll be joined in conversation with Professor Chun following her prepared remarks. So thank you both for joining us. And Dr. Kang, I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Hello there. Hi, and thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Claire and Chris and everybody at the Vail Symposium for inviting me here. This sounds like a fantastic program. I'm going to have to watch a lot more of these in the future. And I am excited to have a Q&A with Professor Chun later, so stay tuned for that. That is definitely going to happen. So we're going to start talking about quackery. So here we go. So just briefly, this book was co-written with a friend of mine, Nate Peterson, who happens to be both a librarian and a journalist. We had so much fun writing this book together. As we sort of delve into some of the history, I will be mentioning a lot of things that actually show up in a lot of my books. So I do write, as Claire mentioned, I write a lot of fiction for young adults as well as for adults. And those 3 books in the center are medical historical mysteries. And I have to say, I stole a lot of things from my research in quackery, and I put them in these books. Opium and Absinthe is about to release July 1st, but is available as a first reads on Amazon right now. So if you have an interest in medical mysteries, check them out. But onward to the subject of quackery. So the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about snake oil, because how can you not talk about quackery without mentioning snake oil salesmen and snake oil? So if you did see the CBS program, you probably heard me mention this a little bit, but there was an actual snake oil salesman named Clark Stanley, and he was a gentleman who touted this incredible snake oil liniment that would cure everything during the Columbia Exposition at the end of the 1800s. So he did this great show of it by killing a snake and plunging it into boiling water, and when the fat rose to the top, he skimmed it off and he put them into jars, and he said, this stuff will cure absolutely everything. And I think also it works on non-human people. I think he recommends it for animals as well. Well, it turned out after a period of time that they did some testing on the liniment, and they found that there was no snake oil in it. It actually had things like turpentine and pepper, and not a whole lot of snake at all. So he made a fair amount of money off of this, but he is the reason why we call snake oil, and he's the reason why we are very worried about people who are snake oil salesmen, because they're out to make a buck, and they're very well aware of the fact that it doesn't actually cure anything. So another brief mention of the actual word quack, or quackery, and where it comes from. So quackery comes from quacksalver, which is a longer word. It's an old Dutch word, which means somebody who prattles on or boasts loudly or talks very loudly about their salve, so that you can imagine somebody sort of hawking their salve on the corner. And so that's where the word comes from. It's a really odd word, but it comes up over and over again, and people are always like, where does that word come from? So now you know. So we're going to move on to one of my favorite subjects. I'll tell you what that subject is in a second, but I want you to take a look at this image. If you can guess what it is, if you said knife, you're like 90% right, but you'll probably notice that there is a bit of a bump on the tip of that curved blade. So this is actually not any knife. It's called a fleam, F-L-E-A-M. And a fleam is a particular type of knife that was used to pierce a large blood vessel, usually a vein. And in doing that, it lets you bleed generally animals. This one was a big one, so it was probably for horses, for the sake of trying to make them better. So bloodletting. Why would we bleed people when we know pretty much the vast majority of the time it's better to keep the blood inside your body than outside your body? Well, it turns out bloodletting has been going on for a really long time. But the reason for it is because of a very old concept of medical health called the humoral theory. So this starts way back in the time of Hippocrates and was very much alive during the last millennia. The concept was that your body had these 4 elements in them, and they were always in balance, or they were hopefully in some balance. These 4 elements, these 4 humors, were black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. So if you had a little bit more of one of these humors than the other one, sometimes it would even confer a personality trait. So for example, if you had a sanguine personality, you had more blood in you and you tend to be positive and cheerful. If you were phlegmatic, you were calm and peaceful. If you were melancholic, you had more black bile in you and you tended to be introverted and analytic. If you were choleric, you had more yellow bile in you, and so your personality is a little bit more extroverted and goal-oriented and ambitious. So choleric, I think, was the old type A personality. But a lot of times when you were sick, doctors would say, well, you have a little bit too much black bile in you, so we need to get rid of the black bile. And one way to get rid of black bile was by purging, vomiting, or giving you something that gave you horrible, horrible diarrhea. If you had too much blood, then it was by bleeding and phlebotomy, which is the fancy word for taking blood out of you. And so that's why bloodletting was probably one of the most used treatments for many, many hundreds of years. And it's because most people thought that a lot of the diseases that were out there were oftentimes because there was too much blood in the body. So to even out the humors, you got to take the blood out. So this is another little nifty mechanism. It's called the brass scarificator, which sounds like a really frightening movie, but it's actually, you can buy these on eBay. So you can look these up later and get one of your own if you would like to. But it's this tiny little brass box. It has about, let's count here, about 12 spring-loaded tiny blades in it. And what you would do is you would hold the box up to your arm and you would sort of loosen the trigger and boom, you would get 12 little cuts in your arm. And then generally what they would do is they would take a cup and put a little match in there to make a vacuum, put the cup over those cuts, and it would help bleed that area a little bit better. So that was another method of bleeding. Now, you probably all know what this is. Interestingly enough, I always keep an eye out for this, but you just don't see these around very much these days. Not at all, it's a barber pole. So a barber pole was the way that barber surgeons back in the day, starting from the Middle Ages on, they were also called tonsures. These were the men who were responsible for doing a lot of the bleeding. So sometimes the physician would go and order, you should have this amount of blood taken out, and they would go to the barber surgeon, and it was the barber surgeon who would do it. And they would also cut your hair and, you know, lance boils and trim your toenails, and you could get all done at the barber surgeon. The pole actually symbolized a rod that you would hold onto. You know, when you're getting your blood drawn and they put a tourniquet on you and you're sort of squeezing your hand, when you'd squeeze this pole. The white stripe was symbolic of the tourniquet or the rags used to clean the blood up. And the red and the blue stripes would symbolize either the red blood or the blue of the vein that was being lanceted in order to bleed you. So a lot of times at the bottom of the barber pole, there was also this sort of cup which gathered the blood as well. And so these have a very, very old history, even though we don't really see them very much these days. So we're going to talk a little bit about another way of bleeding. So this is a lovely little woodcut of a woman who is applying leeches to herself. So leeches is another way of doing bloodletting. Why would we do this? So going back to that humors, remember we mentioned about we would do it because sometimes, you know, you had a fever, so you got bled. Sometimes you had dropsy, which is like an old-fashioned word for too much fluid or maybe even heart failure symptoms. Any kind of infection, oftentimes they would do bleeding. But sometimes the bleeding that was done via a lancet and cutting from the arm, where you take out a pint or two, was a little too much. They wanted a little bit more of a delicate touch. So a lot of times people would like to bleed in the area where they wanted to treat something. So for example, if you had an ear infection, they would want to maybe bleed around your ear, but you can't really take a knife to that area. It's a little messy. And so they would use something that was a little bit more precise. They would use a leech. So these leeches, basically you could put on this tiny little area, and it would take out maybe half a teaspoon or half a tablespoon of fluid, and you could use them anywhere on your body. And so when I said near your ear, you could also use it on your stomach, on your back, on your arm. They also used it internally. So if you had swollen tonsils, you could get a leech put on your tonsils, and they would sew a little thread through the tail end of the leech so they could yank it back out. You could have them put in internally. For example, if you had menses that were painful, you might have internal leeches put on. If you were a gentleman, you might have leeches put on your prostate, through your rectum. They even had a special, instrument for putting them in there. So I think everybody's groaning right now, so we'll move on to this next one here. But these are actually glass, little glass applicator tubes that you use to put the leeches exactly where you want them. So those are also available on eBay, I believe. This is what the bite of a leech looks like. It looks like this little Mercedes-Benz kind of three-way bite. The leech has this amazing mouth, which is that it's got 3 jaws, and on each jaw it has like 100 teeth, and it's got several stomachs. But it doesn't hurt very much because there is this as yet undiscovered anesthetic in their saliva, but it also has, going a little faster. But it does also have an anticoagulant in it so that the blood can just keep flowing and the leech can keep drinking and drinking. So here we go. This is a video of a leech. So I'm going to show this to you. This guy was actually a pet of mine that I used to take on some of my lectures during my lecture circuit year of 2017. As you can see, his name is Leechifer. I know we named him. So he's actually looking for something to eat right now. We would feed him with frozen thawed blocks of beef liver that he would suck on. And he did go missing one day, and I never found him again. I'm fairly sure he somehow made an escape to the outdoors somehow, or got sucked up into my vacuum cleaner. But he is no more, sadly. But that is what a leech looks like. They have these cute little brown and orange dots. They're actually kind of cute. But, all right, we're going to move on to another subject, which is gold, really briefly. So gold is one of those elements that is really fascinating because you don't really think of it as a medication, but gold from time out of mind has been something that is worth a lot. It's very precious. It is immutable, meaning that it's very hard to change. You can put acid on it, heat on it, do all sorts of things, and it doesn't really react very much. It sort of stays gold. It doesn't tarnish. And so a lot of people thought, well, gold must have these medical qualities to it. Maybe it can make you live forever. Maybe it's good for your heart. It would make a good cordial. It'd be warming to the heart. But the problem with gold, if anybody's ever had Goldschlager or had gold on one of their little fancy desserts, is that if you eat gold, it passes right through you unchanged. And people knew this way back when. So they did try to make a version of gold where you could swallow it and you would actually absorb it. And when they did that, they found that it was incredibly caustic. It caused kidney damage. It caused all sorts of horrible side effects. So it didn't get used nearly as much as they would like, unfortunately. But that didn't prevent charlatans from saying that they had these medications that had gold in them and that they were really, really good for your heart and all that sort of thing. So gold was a big part of that sort of glistening, shiny, look at this is going to cure you, but doesn't actually have a substance to it, because a lot of times these things didn't really have gold in them. Case in point, so there was a Dr. Keeley at the end of the 19th century who decided that he would try to go out and cure all the addicts in the world, people who were alcoholics, who had an opium habit. And he created this cure called the Keeley cure, which was a combination of injections and a potion that you would drink. And this would cure you of your alcoholism. So he actually had Keeley Institutes all across America. There were some here in Nebraska. There were in New York, pretty much all over the place. And you would go to these sanitariums and tell them that you were, had a problem with addiction. And they would give you a couple of shots a day and you would drink this tonic a couple of times a day. And he claimed that the tonic had gold in it. Well, he also claimed that he could cure pretty much everybody, but of course he didn't do follow-up studies, so most people just relapsed anyway. That being said, at some point in time, somebody secretly took one of the bottles and they tested it for gold, and it didn't have any gold in it. So this was one of those things where I think he kind of believed it really did help, but it didn't have what he said it had in it. And on top of it, when they did test for it, they found that what was in these tonics were things like marijuana, and strychnine, and a bunch of really other terrible things. So really not the best thing in the world. So we're going to move on a little bit to one of my favorite topics. I don't know why this is going so fast. I'm going to try to slow this down. One of my favorite topics. So this is a gallows. There was a period of time, this is actually in England, where when there was an execution, people would go rush to the execution site because actually it was, it was entertainment, sadly. But when some of the criminals had been hung, people would go rush up to the corpses and they would immediately rub their skin. If they had like a boil or a rash or a rheumatic wrist, they would go and rub this like ill body part up against the corpse because they thought it would confer this healthy something to heal them. Sometimes if there were beheadings, people would come up and try to gather the freshly spilled blood in a cup and drink it to cure their epilepsy. There are tales of, during the gladiator fights that people would actually eat liver and drink the gladiator blood to also cure epilepsy. So the concept of consuming other human beings, cannibalism or corpse medicine, has been around for quite some time. We find that really, really horrific. And it's kind of interesting that we do, because we also do things that I think other people would consider barbaric, but we are completely acclimated to the culture of it, such as, kidney transplants and blood transfusions. That's all okay. But back then, consuming another person was actually considered okay. The idea was that if you get this young, healthy body that was killed fairly quickly and violently, the reason for that being a good thing is that you don't want someone who's older, who's infirm, who's female, but anybody who's been suffering from some sort of chronic illness. So generally, the people who were dying at executions were these young, healthy men. And so they were the ones who were at the peak of their health. And so they had this sort of magical essence of health in them. And that's why people would try to get that sort of healthiness from them. So it is a bit of magical thinking. There were other methods that people would do. They would sometimes cook blood and eat the blood. They would grind up skulls, and hopefully that ground up skull powder would help with things like headaches and epilepsy. Again, they thought this was the seed of, where the problem was, which is actually correct. But there were other ways of getting corpse medicine as well. So axon hominis is actually human fat. Yes, human fat. You heard me right. So some of those executioners, they were making a pretty little penny, actually, harvesting the fat off of criminals after they had been executed and rendering it down and selling the fat. The fat could be used to cure rabies, rheumatism, joint pain, things like that. It was called executioner salve, or I think it was poor man's salve, and man's grease. They had all sorts of really tasty names for it. And you would think, oh, well, that was, hundreds of years ago. Well, here's actually from the early 20th century. These are sterile glass ampules of rendered human fat that people were using. This is the early 1900s, so not that long ago, really. All right, more corpse medicine, because it's one of my favorite subjects. I'm sorry to say, because it's kind of fascinating in a gory way, but it is really fascinating. So mummy was actually also something that was used as this incredible remedy that people thought was the end all and be all of a treatment. So mummy actually comes from mumia, which is a Persian word for wax. And there was this bitumen, this substance, this waxy substance that was also used for poultices. And apparently in preserved mummies, some of that preservation stuff looked black. And so they thought it was the same thing and it could be healing. So it sort of, those words sort of got not jumbled around exactly, but that's eventually how the word mummy kind of came from. Now, mummies were actually imported into England. They were ground up and sold in these, this is actually a real apothecary jar, but you can Google mummy apothecary jars. There are a bunch around. And yes, they actually really did sell ground up mummy, and it was supposed to cure pretty much anything under the sun. The interesting thing about mummy is that there was actually quackery going around when it came to mummy. So, when you wanted to buy real mumia, like you wanted to get the good stuff that actually came from Egypt, that was a real mummy that was, stolen from one of these tombs, which is pretty awful. But you also, there were some people who were like, oh, well, any old corpse will do. And so they would just use other corpses from England, or they would just take dirt and ashes and just sell it off and pretend it was mummy. So there was mummy quackery, which is a whole other level of quackery that kind of happened back then. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about, switch gears here to opium. So, wow, this is a big, big subject, and opium has been around for so long. I think back in 3000 BC, the Sumerians called it the joy plant, and the ancient Egyptians used it for pain remedies. Opium has been around for a very, very long time. We've known for ages that it is incredibly good at taking care of pain. But they also thought it could be good at curing other things. Not necessarily curing pain, but relieving pain, but they thought it could cure a whole host of other things. Deafness, bad vision, vertigo, epilepsy, of course. Everything is always trying to cure epilepsy, because they didn't really understand it, and they just pretty much threw everything at that diagnosis. But in around the 15th century or so, opium was turned into this new concoction by this guy. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. Good luck to you guys. I'll give you a second to try to say it. But anyway, this guy is also known as, which is easier to pronounce, Paracelsus. So Paracelsus, he created a new version, a new concoction with opium called laudanum. So laudanum comes from the word laudaire, to praise, because this new stuff that he made was so good. It contained things like amber, coral, pearls, crushed pearls, musk, cinnamon, cloves. Apparently it contained unicorn horn. I think that was probably a staghorn or narwhal or something like that. Apparently, it also contained mummy. But laudanum was this fantastic cure-all treatment that a lot of people used. And later on, towards the 17th, 18th century, laudanum was just incredibly common. And it didn't have all those crazy things that Paracelsus had put into it, but it was a little bit tastier to drink, and it was easy to get. But on top of laudanum, just opium syrup in general was very, very easy to get. It was like on the grocery shelves. You didn't need a prescription. You could just go pick it up, and people used it for all sorts of things. So a lot of unfortunate, babies were given opium because they were crying too much and their moms were tired, or they had to go to work, because women really entered the workforce a lot during the 19th century. Even I think Alexander Hamilton actually talked about giving opium to babies in order to wean them from the breast. Like, he was like, I highly recommend this. So it was just very, very common. So why would people do that? Why would people use opium all the time? I mean, the obvious answer is it gets you high. So people like the way it felt. But when you think in terms of all the other things that were out there as treatments, like, these medicines that would make you vomit all the time, these medicines that would make you have horrible diarrhea, bloodletting, leeches. In comparison, opium is pretty nice. So it was a go-to for all sorts of things, and it was easily accessible and not terribly expensive. And so that's why, people went for it. Now, at the turn of the century, they were realizing they were having a lot of issues with addiction. There were some chemists who were able to synthesize this new chemical called diacetylmorphine from opium. And they thought, this stuff is great. It's incredibly potent. You don't have to use very much. It is good for pain. It is good for coughs. And so the company Bayer actually marketed this new chemical, and they called it heroin, because after, I think of the German word for heroic, because that's how it made them feel in the lab when they tested it. They don't do that anymore. But anyway, heroin went on the market as a non-addictive painkiller, a cough medicine. It was in pastilles. And within just a couple of years of it being out on the market, and all the doctors praising, saying this is the way to go, forget morphine, forget opium, this is like, the perfect medication, they realized their mistake. And it was pulled off the market. But unfortunately, heroin was in the world, and it never left, sadly. Let me see how I'm doing on time. I'm going to try to wrap things up in the next 5 or 7 minutes, just so we have time for Q&A. So Mercury is one of my favorite subjects. It's actually the first chapter I wrote, and I'm kind of obsessed with this element. It's so neat. The periodic abbreviation is Hg for hydrargyrium, which means water silver. Raise your hand if you have played with mercury that came from a broken, what do you call it? I'm blanking on the word. Thermometer, thank you. As a kid, and don't worry, you will not die of mercury poisoning because you played with the mercury from a thermometer. But it is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature. Very, very cool. And that little symbol in the middle is the alchemy symbol for mercury, which is very cute. And that little bottle on the right, calomel, is a mercury salt, mercurous chloride. And it was one of the most commonly used mercury medicines that was used for hundreds of years. So why mercury? Well, first of all, when you took calomel, it made you have horrible diarrhea. And sometimes the diarrhea was kind of blackish colored. And so they thought that was good. You're getting... So Claire's telling me that people did raise their hand. That's pretty funny. Basically, it would give you terrible diarrhea. And a lot of times that diarrhea was black. So people thought, oh, this is great. We are getting rid of the black bile. So again, back to the humoral theory. This was one way to sort of even things out. And calomel was used for many, many things. But one of the most famous diseases that it was used for was syphilis. So this is a woodcut from 1689. That poor gentleman on the bottom right has syphilis, and he's got the sores all over. It was also called the Great Pox. There's a person in the middle, the bottom, who is actually getting vaporized mercury to help with his syphilitic sores, which is also an incredibly poisonous way of getting mercury. Inhaling the vapor is very, very toxic. There's a gentleman at the top lying in bed who is either vomiting or he's got a water flow of saliva coming out his mouth into a bucket. Because one of the signs that you've taken enough mercury to cure syphilis was that you were having copious amounts of saliva, which is actually a toxicity of mercury. So that's how you knew you were taking enough mercury, is that you were having all these toxic signs. But some of the other symptoms were pathologic shyness, sighing, Mad Hatter shakes. So you've probably heard of the Mad Hatter. There was a lot of mercury involved in the felting process of making hats. So people who in the hatting industry would get mercury poisoning as well. So we're going to talk about, this is a great little snippet of history. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, one of our founding fathers, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was really battling the yellow fever epidemic with copious amounts of mercury and bloodletting. People called it heroic depletion therapy. And simply, some people said that they were bleeding people and enough to, that was fit enough to like kill a horse, something like that. I'm getting my words wrong. But the point was, Benjamin Rush was a huge fan of these purgatives and bleeding. So he created this, this pill called the Thunderbolt, which was a potent mixture of jalap, which is an herbal laxative, and mercury. And you took it and it would make you poop your brains out. Well, he was also the official physician for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So he wrote up this huge document, which I read, and it was really kind of awful because he would just write, if you have a headache, take purging pills. If you have a stomach ache, take purging pills. If you feel off, take purging pills. And so poor Lewis and Clark had all these, they had like 500 Thunderbolts with them. So every time they felt sick, they would just take a Thunderbolt and poop their brains out. So at some point in time, we know the way that Lewis and Clark made their way across the United States, but it wasn't exactly clear where their campsites were. And so several years ago in Lolo, Montana, they were able to locate what they thought was the kitchen campfire of one of Lewis and Clark's sites. So they did some testing, I think, of the lead samples, and they said, you know what, this should be from the right time. It could be them. But it turns out Lewis and Clark's expedition was a military one. And the military book, they had this like military blue book that told them they had to put their latrines 300 feet away from their kitchen area. And so they tested samples exactly 300 feet away from where that kitchen fire was. And lo and behold, they found these like deposits of mercury, because that is where Lewis and Clark had pooped out their Thunderbolts. And so that was how they were able to actually pinpoint one true camping site for Lewis and Clark. It's like really kind of gross, but at the same time, pretty fascinating. So one last note on Mercury. That guy in the middle, that is the god Mercury. He's holding a little something in his hand, and that is the caduceus. And if you look at the bottom of the caduceus, you'll see there are two snakes, and there's supposed to be two sets of wings on them as well. So the caduceus is often thought of as the symbol for medicine. If you look on the left side, you'll see this is the symbol for the Army Medical Corps in 1902. Well, what they were trying to actually use was the rod of Asclepius. So the rod of Asclepius is a Greek god of health and healing, and his rod is a single rod with a snake around it, one snake and no wings. That was the rod that was supposed to be on the Army Medical Corps symbol, but they accidentally used Mercury's, and that was wrong, because Mercury is the Roman god. He's the god of thieves and the fat purse and trickery, which in the realm of quackery just made so much sense. So these days, if you look around and you see a medical sign anywhere, any place, and it's got the two wings and the two snakes, you can tell them you've got the wrong symbol on your sign. It's supposed to be the rod of Asclepius, which is just one little snake. So that little symbol on the right, the blue one, that's for the WHO, and it is correct. So now you know how to pick out the people who just grab something off of Google to make their medical signs. So one last quick, funny cartoon for you. I just love that. That's so funny. Just want to shout out to my co-author, Nate Peterson. Nate and I are currently writing our second book, our follow-up to Quackery, called Patient Zero, and it's going to be about pandemics and the history of a lot of these infectious diseases. So stay tuned for that. And if you want to find me, that's my website. There's my Twitter. I'm on Instagram posting about bread and puppies all the time. So if you don't want to see the quackery stuff, you don't have to. And I'm going to, we're going to stop that and go back to Claire and Professor Chun. So we're going to hopefully get some Q&A to talk a little bit about quackery some more and keep the conversation going.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kang. That was really, really fascinating. So the first question I have for you is probably one of the bigger ones that I think people will have, which is, why is there still so much quackery today, right? Like, we like to pride ourselves as 21st century people as being, well-versed in science, but there's still definitely an allure of like a quick fix for things. Like, so why is there still so much kind of snake oil available? Why do people fall for it?
Really good question. I think it's for several different reasons. So first of all, there are still so many diseases out in the world that we don't have good cures for. And there are a lot of diseases out there where we do have some treatments that are pretty good, but they have some bad side effects, or the side effects are really, really frightening, or the potential side effects are really scared. And I think people like to know that they have other options available. So I think so, as long as we don't have a perfect handle on every disease out there and we don't have a perfect cure that is free, has zero side effects, and is available to everybody, there's always going to be somebody out there who is willing to prey on your hopes and fears and sell you something that they claim is going to be way better than whatever's out there that like maybe mainstream medicine has for you. So it's always going to be there. I think there might be a time where it stops, but not for a very, very long time.
And that actually made me think of something else, which is, I noticed this as I was reading your book. There seems to be a link between kind of medicine and faith, where some of these quack remedies depend on patients believing that they work. Like, even sometimes people would say, like, it won't work if you don't believe in it. Mm-hmm. So is this just the placebo effect, or is this something bigger at work?
I think a lot of it is placebo effect. I think people discount how powerful placebo can be. There's a reason why when we do randomized control trials, we include a placebo arm, because many times when you do a trial like that, you will see that some people in the placebo arm do well. And, so it's not to be discounted, but the concept of believing and having faith in something, I do believe that there is a link between the mind and the body, and that is not, it's not like everything just sort of stops here and then there's all this stuff and then we just don't pay attention to what's going on here. That has a lot to do with how our bodies react to things. So for sure, I think there is something to that. I think there's probably going to be more studies going on to delve into that a little bit. But the belief, and I also want to throw this word in because we may end up talking a little bit more about it, but the bias that you have towards or against certain things is incredibly powerful. It is what fuels so much of how we even navigate our world, is all these biases. And there's biases with everything. With race, there's biases with, the medicine that you seek out, and the things that you believe about your body, and the products that you purchase every day. We are constantly being affected by these things that we are not even aware of. And so I think that's where faith plays a little part of that as well, is what you believe in, and how much does that take you in one direction or another.
Interesting. So then where would we draw the line, right, between something that's experimental, that, maybe a doctor hopes is going to work, and something that's, quackery, right, something that's a snake oil salesman? Like, where is that line? Like with the gold cure for alcoholism, how he had, he seemed to truly believe he could cure, all addiction, right, without actually putting gold in the bottles, Right. So how do we draw that line?
Well, back then, there wasn't really rigorous testing on treatments. And so there wasn't a good way to decide, like, how do we actually know this is working? A lot of what really fueled the beliefs in the medical system were, well, we've been doing this for hundreds of years, so this is how it has to be. And that status quo is incredibly powerful. So to go against that, there was a lot of difficulties, just sort of like with the germ theory, just believing that there are actually germs out there, that sort of a thing. But nowadays, when there is something new that's out there that is a potential treatment, there are plenty of people who are willing to rigorously study it in a way where we can get actual data to tell us, like, does this work or does it not work? What are the side effects, or are there, problems with it that we don't realize are there? When somebody touts, like, if you're, this ad starts showing up on Facebook or something like that saying like, oh, we have this like great, cure for X disease, right? And they'll say, studies show that it's got like a 80% effectiveness, right? Well, that sounds fantastic. But if you click on the study, number one is, do you feel confident enough to read that study and understand if it's good or not? And number two, they might not even say that, like, that might be enough for you to buy it. And so knowing the difference between experimentation that's legitimate and quackery really comes down to being a very, very smart consumer and having your radar up for that. So anything that touts that something is like absolutely amazing and wonderful and has no side effects and will give you guaranteed results, you should already know that there's something going on there. The interesting thing is that there is actually a bias out there that's called, let me see, what is it called? The ambiguity effect. This is a bias. I was just reading about this earlier today, which is that it's a bias against something that can't guarantee you a positive outcome. So you know how when you go to see a doctor and you're like, well, the doctor's like, oh, you need to be on this medication and it should work for you, but I can't tell you 100% it's going to work. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I want something better than that. And meanwhile, you click on some random pop-up ad that promises 100% guarantee, it's going to be awesome, that sort of a thing. So your mind just automatically wants to go to the thing that's going to give you what you want. But the honest truth is that where you find a little bit more of that ambiguity, like, well, it could help, but it couldn't, there are side effects or risks and there are benefits, chances are that's actually probably where you're more likely to get the kind of result that you need that's been studied in a safe way and that sort of thing. So a lot of rambling basically to say that listen to your hackles when you start to sort of get that feeling that someone's trying to really sell you hard on something and it's telling you there's like nothing, there are no downsides to it. That's a problem, so.
Good to know. So a lot of the medical practices you described, right, like bleeding, things like that, were accepted by doctors as the most effective treatment. Yeah. So what would you say, what's your best guess for something that's commonplace today that 100 years from now, people are going to say, I can't believe that they willingly subjected themselves to that? What's the thing that's just not, will be completely incomprehensible?
Oh my gosh, there are so many things. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to be hopeful and say that someday there's going to be treatment for diabetes where they're going to laugh at the way that we are treating diabetes now. Like they'll be like, well, there is no diabetes in the future. Like we just shut it down. Like we just inject this thing and the pancreas works and your body listens to the insulin. It does exactly what it's supposed to do. And like, you took all these pills for it? You injected insulin? Like, so it would be really cool if someday that wasn't a problem, because I just see so many bad side effects from the disease taking place in people, and it's just awful. So I would love for like there to be this like diabetes cure so we could like look back on it and be like, this is ridiculous. I think cancer screening is going to be very state of the art. Like in 100 years, we do cancer screening by looking inside your colon and, smushing breast tissue in a mammogram machine to look for cancer. And somehow I just feel like it's going to be so much easier later on. It's going to be a breath test, or it's going to be a really quick blood test, or you'll know, at birth, like, well, it's going to happen if all goes well, like at this age. And so they're going to take care of it before it even pops up. So I think things are going to be so different on the front of like cancer screening someday.
Yeah, we can definitely hope.
Yeah,
So,
we can hope for a mammogram someday. That would be great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Until then, get your mammogram.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we have time to get to audience questions, but if you had to pick one treatment from your book that you would undergo, what would it be and why?
Oh my gosh. That's really funny because when we started to write the book, Nate and I were like, Nate was like, hey, how about we try one of them just to see what it's like? So he was like, I'll do a little strychnine. I was like, no, we're not doing that. And of course I had this leech for several months and everybody kept asking me like, are you going to let the leech bite you? And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So the answer to that question would be the King's touch. So we have a chapter where we talk about how for a very long time in England, it was thought that the king, if they touched you, they could cure you of certain diseases like scrofula, which is a type of tuberculosis. So like kings and queens would go around and just like touch a bunch of people. So I would love it if like I had a problem and it could get cured by me talking to like Prince William for a little while. And he just like patted my face and was just like, it's gone. And I could actually hang out with Prince William for a while. Like that would be cool. So that would be my choice. The King's touch. He's not king yet, but he will be. So
close enough. I think that's a wise choice. That seems like the most painless option.
I agree. I chose it very carefully because I was like not doing pretty much any of those other things, just not going there.
All right. So Claire, you said it looks like we've got some audience questions coming in. I want to make sure we have time for that.
Yes, we do. And I wanted to, before I get to the questions, just share with Dr. Kang that somebody mentioned that they just finished reading Opium and Absinthe. And you'll be happy to know they had a tough time putting it down and that they absolutely recommend the book.
Great. Actually, when I wrote that book, one of the ideas of it came from, like I said, doing research for Quackery, because they had been able to separate morphine out from opium in the 19th century. And in the mid-19th century, they developed the syringe. So you can imagine back then it was like metal and it was handcrafted and all this kind of stuff. And it came in this case and syringes were really expensive. And so the first morphine addicts were these wealthy women who were injecting themselves with morphine for things like hysteria, which we now know is not a real disease. But it all came from me researching. And I was like, it would be, the opiate epidemic is terrible. But I think we all have in our mind this idea of like, oh, what an addict would look like, when in truth it can be anybody. But I thought it would be kind of interesting to look back in time and actually see somebody who you would never really expect to be an addict be somebody like it was it was happening in these rich ladies, and very quietly sort of behind the scenes. So I thought that was very fascinating.
Well, Bob's question takes us back to the 19th century, and he asked, what impact did the temperance movement have on patent medicine quackery?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that question. I do know that the patent medicine was really, really huge at the turn of the century because people were taking things like opium and cocaine, alcohol, tinctures. They were mixing all sorts of things together and anybody could sell it. And they could pretty much promise that it could do anything that they wanted and they weren't getting in trouble for it. And so after the turn of the century, they started making rules about, like the Pure Food and Drug Act, where you couldn't actually lie about what was in there. And they started to make rules about you can't just put opium in anything. And so there were regulations about that. And that basically kind of stopped the whole patent medicine thing from happening. Now, that being said, you would have thought that stopped quackery from happening, but quackery just changed. It just morphed from, those types of patent medicines to other things. Now, the temperance movement, interestingly, a lot of people were like, well, alcohol is bad. Wine and beer and all those sorts of things are terrible. But you could find alcohol in all of these little drugstore tinctures that were on display at the grocery store. And so people would just be like, oh, I'm feeling a little tired. I'm going to drink some of this tonic. And they would get their little dose of alcohol. So I think it was a way for people to get by and be like, well, this is socially okay because it's medicine, as opposed to actually getting drunk on something else. So I think it was sort of a little sideways of getting around the whole temperance thing. For some people.
Gary wants to know if CBD is the new snake oil.
That's a good question. CBD, I'm sort of waiting for more information on CBD. It's out there and it's used a lot. And the only time it's really come up, like in my practice, is like whether or not it's actually helpful for seizures. And my understanding is that it's been studied in pediatric seizures, but only when it's like intractable and it's not, other medications aren't working. So like it's getting studied in these tiny little areas where they think, and I think there's going to be a lot more coming out about where it's going to be helpful. So I think it's still sort of up in the air. I haven't really made a decision, and in Nebraska, it's still illegal. So I just don't get a ton of people and questions flooding about that because you can't use it. So people here don't use it, or they don't, disclose it. So I'd be interested to find out what the doctors in Colorado are saying about it, and whether or not they're, what kind of interesting anecdotes they're getting from their patients. So that'd be kind of interesting.
Well, our next question is about the Food and Drug Administration. And this person asks, should the Food and Drug Administration require that all treatments being offered show peer-reviewed evidence? Should the government protect consumers more aggressively?
I would love for that to be the case. I think the more protections that we can do for the consumer, the better. I think the problem is person power and money, and being able to have the time to test all of these things. And there's, the rules about, what is like a dietary supplement versus what's actually like a drug, that sort of a thing, plays into what we're allowed to test or not. Sometimes, it's funny how hydroxychloroquine has come up in the news so much with COVID and everything. But I did this case study on it a long time, like 8-10 years ago, on its possible usage as a diabetes medication because it makes you hypoglycemic. And I remember talking to people in the diabetes group at my hospital, and I was like, this could actually be a great diabetes drug if the side effects weren't too bad and that sort of thing. And how come nobody's studying it? And they're like, there's no money in it because hydroxychloroquine is generic. Who's going to fund that? And there's all these really wealthy, drug companies trying to push this medicine and that medicine, and nobody wanted to study it. But I thought that was very interesting in that a lot of this is, it all comes out to where the fund's going to come from. I wish, if I had it my way, I wish that everything that was out there had a handful of really good studies to support it, including just the dietary supplements that you can just buy right off the shelf without a prescription, so we could find out if it's helpful or not. Now, that being said, there are a lot of things that are studied. So like vitamin D, which everybody can buy, it was just this really hot supplement that everybody has been using for the last, 5 to 10 years. And when we first started using it, we thought it would be great for allergies and heart disease and all this kind of stuff. And so because it was such a hot topic, a lot of people studied it, and we did get really good data. It's not nearly as helpful as we thought it was going to be. It's definitely helpful in certain situations, but it's not the cure-all, end-all, be-all of everything, which is what we first believed. And that's generally what happens when things get really popular all of a sudden, is that we kind of hope and it's going to take care of so many different things. And it turns out we get to narrow it down and find out what it's really good for.
Well, that leads me to my next question. And maybe you've answered it to the extent that you want to, but this person is asking, do you think hydroxychloroquine is a form of modern day quackery as a cure for the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, that's a big question. And I may upset some people with this, but I think that it was very reasonable to consider hydroxychloroquine early on. They knew that in tissue samples and in tissue culture that it did retard viral replication or viruses. And so it made sense to try it out, but the whole throwing it at everything and people just using it off label without being in a study, I thought was kind of dangerous. And then to tout it before we had solid evidence by the powers that be, I thought was incredibly dangerous and not very wise. And there have been people who decided to go out there and get chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, and they got really sick, and some people have died from it. So I think at this point in time, there is enough data to show that it's not going to be the cure that we want it to be. I think the antivirals that they're working on right now, I think show more promise right now, but hydroxychloroquine, I think, is petered out. So I think over the course of the next 6 months, we're going to get more and more information from the studies that already started that are going to really let us know if it's officially as not helpful and as we think it is. But right now, it's not considered a go-to treatment for COVID, according to the sources that I've been looking at. So.
Okay, so the last question, and I'm going to this one only because you had one of these as a pet, but one of our attendees has asked, aren't leeches back in?
Leeches have never left to a certain degree. So leeches, I think there are some people who use leeches for different medical problems, and that I don't know. I can't really speak to that because I haven't looked at modern leeches used for like non-mainstream medicine reasons. But there are certain types of surgeries. For example, let's say like the tip of your nose gets cut off in like a terrible chef accident, and someone has to sew the tip of your nose back on. Well, it's this delicate, tiny piece of tissue. And if you have a lot of swelling there, the swelling might be so much that you cut off the circulation to that little piece of tissue. And so sometimes surgeons will actually apply a leech to that area. And what happens is the leech, because it's got this natural anticoagulant in there, is that it will sort of decongest, decompress that sort of pressure and that buildup of blood, so that that tissue doesn't get squeezed so hard that it loses its blood supply. So in certain types of surgical reconstructions, like tip of finger, tip of nose, or flap reconstructions, I believe leeches are still used. And at my medical center, I think the last time I asked my pharmacist, they do keep leeches in stock for the surgeons. So they are still around and they are still used, but not the way that they were used, at least from my understanding, not the way that they were used, 150 years ago. So.
Dr. Kang, I can't thank you enough. What a fascinating discussion. Professor Chun, thank you as well for joining us, and thank all of you at home for tuning in this evening. And I hope we'll see you at one of our future programs. Thank you so much, everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.